My mom wants me to marry my creepy stepbrother and have his child. She now harasses me at work and lies about the inheritance. There's a strange feeling that hits you when you see an old name light up your phone screen, a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and sometimes a cold wave of dread. That's how I felt the morning I saw a message from my mother. It had been over a decade since I'd last heard from her. In fact, the last words she'd spoken to me were that she was done with me. That she had no further responsibility as my mother. I had walked away that day, feeling like an orphan by choice rather than by fate. And since then, I'd crafted a new life. One free of the fear, chaos, and manipulation that had once been all too familiar. So what was she doing? Reaching out now? What could she possibly want after all these years? With a tentative curiosity, I opened her message, bracing myself for whatever she had to say. Her words were laced with a forced sweetness that felt completely foreign coming from her. Hello. Sweetheart, it's been so long. I hope you're doing well. I've missed you. The words landed awkwardly, like an echo of someone else's voice rather than hers. As a child, I would have given anything to hear those words, to feel that kind of affection from her. But I wasn't that child anymore. Still, a small part of me wanted to believe she'd change. Maybe she had come to some kind of realization, found remorse, or finally understood the pain she had caused. I took a deep breath and responded politely, mentioning my work as a nurse practitioner, the life I'd built, the little things that made me happy. I shared just enough to satisfy her curiosity but held back, not yet ready to reveal my world to someone who had spent years tearing it down. Her replies came quickly, each one a little too eager. She wanted to know all about my life, asking probing questions about my job, my finances, my plans for the future. It wasn't long before her mask slipped, and her real intentions emerged. Chris has had a tough time these last few years, she wrote, and I was thinking, well, you know, it might be nice for you two to be there for each other. He's really struggled with his student debt, and I just thought, maybe you could help him. He could use a little support. Chris, the name alone brought a wave of memories I had fought hard to forget. Chris, my stepbrother, the golden child, my mother's favorite, the one who, even as a teenager, had made it his mission to bully, humiliate, and terrify me, and she wanted me to support him? My hands shook as I read the message, an all too familiar sense of dread creeping up my spine. My mind reeled back to the past, the house we shared as children. The countless times he had locked me in closets, stolen my things, and whispered threats that only I would hear. His face flashed in my mind. Older, but just as cruel, just as calculating. No, this wasn't just a request for financial help. This was something darker, something twisted. I barely finished reading her message before my phone slipped from my hand, falling onto the table. The last words of her text blinked up at me, filling the screen with an impossible, nauseating suggestion. Chris has always loved you. And now that you're both adults, it's time to consider building a future together. Family should be together. Family. It was a word I'd long since stripped of sentimentality. A word that held more pain than comfort. As I stared at her message, my heart hardened, steeling itself for what I now knew was the beginning of a final chapter with her. This time, I would not be manipulated. This time, I would face her darkness, and I would not let it consume me. After the shock of my mother's request settled, I spent the next few days processing her words and their implications. Old wounds reopened, and memories surfaced in waves, each more painful than the last. The childhood I tried so hard to bury returned in agonizing clarity. Years spent under Chris's torment. His cruel laughter echoing in my mind, and my mother's blind adoration for him despite his monstrous behavior. I remembered every humiliation, every violation of trust, every moment of fear I endured at his hands. And now, she wanted me to embrace him, to become the family she had always believed us to be. I couldn't accept this. Yet, as disturbing as the message was, it wasn't the end. My mother was relentless. Each day, she sent new messages, first gentle, then pleading, and finally demanding. Her tone changed rapidly, switching from sweetness to anger to manipulation, her desperation growing with each unanswered text. Finally, she went as far as to show up unannounced at Sam's house, where I was staying. Dragging Chris with her, she demanded that I open the door, screaming that I owed her and Chris everything, that I was selfish for refusing to help the only family I had. Sam, ever protective, insisted I ignore her demands. He told me to stay inside, to keep the doors locked, and not to give in to their emotional warfare. His support was unwavering. He had been my lifeline since I was 16. And now, more than ever, he reminded me that I was not alone. He had been the one to pull me out of the darkness when I fled my mother's house all those years ago. As a teenager, I'd run to him, begging for refuge, desperate to escape the abuse and neglect that had defined my childhood. He and his wife, Sandy, had taken me in, and with them, I had finally found safety. In their home, I experienced kindness, compassion, and love, the things I had long ago believed were only for other people. Not for me. In the days that followed, my mother and Chris escalated their efforts. She began a smear campaign against me, rallying distant relatives, people I had never met, aunts and uncles who, until now, had seemed like figments of my mother's stories. She twisted the truth, painting me as an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her family for selfish reasons. Worse still, she posted lies about me online, accusing me of leading Chris on, of being a temptress who was trying to ruin her precious son's life. It was as though she wanted to rewrite history, casting herself as the misunderstood mother and me as the villain. Despite the horror of it all, I refused to let her narrative define me. With Sam's encouragement, I began gathering evidence, documenting every harassing message, every voicemail, every threat. We contacted a lawyer, hoping to take legal action to stop her harassment once and for all. The process was grueling, and there were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if maybe it would be easier to give in, to pay them off just to make it all go away. But each time I felt my resolve waver, I remembered the years of pain and silence, the years I had spent wishing someone would believe me, would protect me. This was my chance to reclaim my voice, to finally stand up for myself. In the midst of the legal preparations, a shocking revelation surfaced. During a meeting with our lawyer, we discovered that my mother had been embezzling from a trust fund left by my biological father. He had passed away when I was just a baby, and I had only faint memories of him. Stories from my father's side of the family. My mother had led me to believe that he had left nothing, that I was a financial burden to her from the very beginning. But it turned out that my father had left a modest but substantial trust fund for me. One that would have covered my education and given me a stable start in life. Enraged, Sam and I delved deeper into the records, discovering years of fraudulent claims made by my mother. She had drained the fund bit by bit, using fake receipts and lies to justify her withdrawals, all of which had been spent on luxuries and on supporting Chris's lavish lifestyle. It was sickening to realize that the money my father had intended for my future had been squandered on the very person who had tormented me. But with this new information, we now had the evidence we needed to strengthen our case. As our case against her built momentum, I found solace in the simple joys around me, spending time with Sam's children, laughing over dinner with Sandy, and finding support from friends who encouraged me to hold my ground. My life, though touched by shadows, was filled with genuine love, a stark contrast to the hollow, transactional love my mother had tried to offer. I realized that my life was no longer defined by my mother's neglect or Chris's cruelty. I had forged my own path, one where I was surrounded by people who saw me for who I was, who valued and respected me. The final blow came when Chris was arrested. His behavior, unchecked for years, had escalated to the point where he had crossed a line even my mother couldn't protect him from. He was detained for an unrelated crime, a horrifying incident involving a young family member. This revelation shook me to my core, but it also brought a sense of closure. For years, I had feared that he would continue his cycle of abuse, hurting others as he had hurt me. His arrest felt like the end of a dark chapter, a final confirmation that I had done the right thing by walking away. In the aftermath, my mother's calls and messages dwindled. The lawsuit proceeded, and I eventually reclaimed what was left of my father's trust fund. With it, I finally had the financial freedom to start anew, unburdened by the ties that had once bound me to her. I used the funds to invest in a modest home of my own, a place that symbolized my journey to freedom. Today, as I stand on my own 2 feet, I am grateful, not for the pain, but for the strength it has given me. My journey has taught me the value of resilience, the importance of boundaries, and the power of true family. Family isn't about blood, it's about those who stand by you. Who lift you up, who see you through the darkest of times. Sam and Sandy have been more than siblings, they've been my anchors. My champions, my home. The past no longer has a hold on me. The shadows of my childhood have faded, replaced by the warmth of a life I've built on my own terms. As I move forward, I carry with me the hard-earned lesson that we each have the power to rewrite our stories. To rise above the pain and create a future filled with hope, love, and resilience. Once upon a time in the heart of bustling London, there was a project manager. A man with enough pride to fill a skyscraper. His arrogance was well known in his industry. Yet despite this, or perhaps because of it, he had managed to climb to a position of power. His latest endeavor was an £800 historic restoration project on a Grade 1 listed building. But behind this restoration effort lay a secret, a fragile trust between the artisans and contractors essential to the success of the project. In every historic city, there exists an invisible army of specialists who devote their lives to preserving cultural heritage. David was one such specialist. He belonged to a small circle of experts trained in an ancient building technique that had all but vanished. These craftspeople were the unsung heroes of architectural conservation, reviving the past brick by brick, beam by beam. David was part of this small, select group, the kind of man who knew the weight of every brick and the history in every slab. Yet he carried his knowledge humbly, working with a quiet determination. As fate would have it, David's expertise was precisely what the restoration project needed. The lead contractor, ACC Limited, had to ensure that every detail of the building remained historically accurate. The architect overseeing the project recommended a few experts, and the contractor eagerly chose David, unaware that this choice would soon challenge the limits of their patience, understanding, and respect. From the moment David set foot on the site, tensions brewed. It wasn't long before the boss, a man affectionately dubbed the noisy gobshite by those who had experienced his overbearing style, arrived to check on the project. His arrogance was palpable. He strutted around the site as if he were a king surveying his kingdom. For him, this wasn't a project to be carefully handled but a task to be completed as quickly as possible, and with as much flair as his pride demanded. David's patience was tested when the boss began ordering the workers around, barking commands about coffee and other trivial matters. David, focusing on his intricate work, chose to ignore him, staying on task. But the boss wouldn't have it. He thought that David was a mere subcontractor, and therefore, he believed that he had full control over him. When he asked David to fetch him coffee, David politely declined, stating he was there solely to restore the walls and nothing more. The boss was stunned. No one, he thought, had the right to deny his orders. Tempers flared, and within minutes, David was fired on the spot. With his phone in hand, he recorded the conversation, capturing the boss's belligerent attitude for posterity. Leaving with dignity intact, David packed up his tools and walked out. But what the boss failed to understand was that David was irreplaceable. With David gone, the project was thrown into chaos. There were only a handful of people in the entire country who could do what David did, and every one of them had a waiting list that stretched for months. Panic set in as the realization dawned that their only choice was to plead with David to return. The company frantically called David, leaving messages, begging him to come back. But David was unmoved. He had set his terms, a personal apology from the boss and compensation for the lost days. In the world of historical conservation, rushing a job is sacrilege. Yet ACC Limited found itself with no choice but to negotiate on David's terms. They needed the project completed, and they needed it done right. But David's conditions weren't just a matter of compensation, they were a stand for respect. He was tired of being treated like a mere pawn in the games of men who valued their own egos over the delicate art he dedicated his life to. As the project faltered, ACC's site manager was caught in the middle. Known for his fairness and skill, he had tried to advocate for David, recognizing his expertise, but for his efforts, he too faced repercussions. His position was terminated under pressure from the boss. In the end, the site manager's dismissal served as a stark warning to the others on site. Respect was a luxury they couldn't afford under this boss's rule. The boss's downfall was swift and inevitable. Fines from regulatory authorities loomed as the structural integrity of the building began to falter due to the lack of proper restoration. For all his arrogance, the boss had underestimated the intricacies of the work and the importance of those who knew how to do it. The project fell apart, and along with it, the boss's reputation and career. In the quiet after the storm, David continued his work on other projects, valued and respected by those who understood the true worth of his skills. His refusal to return to the project had been a lesson in integrity, one that his former boss would come to regret for years to come. The restoration remained unfinished, a testament to what happens when pride overshadows respect and understanding. My parents tried to give my inheritance to their favorite daughter, but my grandparents had a surprising twist in store. From my earliest memories, the feeling of being invisible was as constant as the air I breathed. I grew up in a family where love seemed to have favorites. And that favorite wasn't me. My younger sister, Amy, was the golden child from the day she arrived. I, on the other hand, was always the shadow, the background, the afterthought. Amy's needs, wants, and whims always took precedence over mine. And it didn't take long for me to understand that in the eyes of my parents. She was simply more deserving, more cherished, more loved. It started small, of course. As a young boy, I noticed Amy had the better birthday parties. Her birthdays came with face painters, bouncy castles, petting zoos, an entire neighborhood celebration. For me, birthdays meant a store-bought cake, a family dinner, and a half-hearted, happy birthday from my parents before they moved on to whatever was going on in Amy's world. But it was more than the birthday parties, it was in the toys she received, the attention she got, the way our parents celebrated her smallest achievements and barely acknowledged mine. I tried hard to get their approval, spending years hoping that if I just did enough, I'd be noticed too. In middle school, I worked diligently to keep my grades up, joining the math club, the science club, and any other extracurricular that would set me apart. When I won a regional science fair, I thought it might finally be my moment. Instead, my parents barely glanced at the certificate I brought home, already preoccupied with Amy's latest minor accomplishment. It wasn't until high school, though, that the favoritism truly sank in. I became the editor of the school newspaper, debate team captain, and worked relentlessly to maintain a perfect GPA, all while Amy skated through school, barely managing to keep a passing grade. One summer, I was selected to attend an elite program at Harvard, a dream come true for me. When I shared the news over dinner, my father's only response was, "That's nice," before he turned the conversation back to Amy's upcoming dance recital. I couldn't even get a ride to the airport when I was leaving for the program because my parents didn't want to miss her performance. I learned, over time, not to expect too much from them. I became self-sufficient, developed a hard shell, and learned to find pride in my accomplishments without looking for parental validation. Yet, every time they showered Amy with praise or comforted her over minor disappointments, a part of me ached, wondering why I had never been enough. By my mid-20s, I had created a life for myself that I could be proud of. I'd graduated college with honors, started a successful career in finance, and even purchased my own home by 27. I thought I'd managed to leave behind the need for my parents' approval. But then, the issue of my grandfather's inheritance came to light, reopening every old wound. When my grandfather passed away, he left behind a substantial estate, accumulated through years of hard work and sacrifice. He'd been a self-made man who valued fairness and integrity. And in his will, he divided his assets equally among his children and grandchildren, including me, Amy, and our cousins. For the first time, I felt that someone in my family truly saw and valued me. My portion of the inheritance was a significant sum, enough to help me pay off student loans, invest in my future, and possibly start my own business someday. But my parents saw things differently. After the will was read, they pulled me aside, saying they felt it was unfair that I was to receive as much as Amy. They argued that because Amy was struggling, still living at home and working part-time in a coffee shop, she needed the money more. I was stunned. Here was my chance to secure my future. And they were asking me to give it up for the sake of their favorite child once again. I tried to explain that the inheritance was my grandfather's choice, not theirs, and that he had specifically intended for all his grandchildren to be treated equally. But my parents wouldn't hear it. They insisted that it was my moral duty to support Amy, guilt-tripping me with every small act of parental support they'd ever given me. As if allowing me to live at home during college or paying for basic necessities negated years of neglect and favoritism. When I refused, my father, acting as executor of the will, took matters into his own hands. He declared he would interpret my grandfather's real intentions and give my entire share to Amy. This was not only illegal but a blatant reminder of how little my parents thought of me. Devastated, I reached out to my grandmother, my grandfather's widow, hoping she might support me. And she did, wholeheartedly. Grandma told me that my parents had actually approached my grandfather years earlier, asking him to leave everything to Amy in his will. He'd refused, insisting that all his grandchildren deserved equal treatment. He'd even included a clause in his will stating that anyone who contested the distribution would forfeit their inheritance. Armed with this knowledge, I confronted my parents. They were shocked and defensive, accusing me of betraying the family by involving others. With my grandmother's help, I sought legal advice. My parents tried to rally the family against me, painting me as selfish and greedy. But most of my relatives saw through their manipulations. My aunts, uncles, and cousins knew of the long-standing favoritism and supported me, understanding that I was simply standing up for what was right. As the battle over the inheritance unfolded, I couldn't help but reflect on the years of resentment I carried. This wasn't just about the money, it was about my worth, my place in the family, and the years of feeling like I was less than Amy. Finally, with my family's support, I managed to keep my share of the inheritance. The will was carried out as my grandfather intended, and my father was removed as executor due to his attempted manipulation. But the fight left scars. My parents stopped speaking to me, blaming me for tearing the family apart. They even warned me that if I kept the money, I would be cut out of their will entirely and never welcomed in their home again. It hurt, but I stood my ground, knowing I was finally defending myself against a lifetime of being cast aside. Then, something unexpected happened. Amy, who had been silent throughout the ordeal, approached me with an apology. She confessed that she'd always known about our parents' favoritism and felt guilty for benefiting from it. She admitted that being the favored child had left her ill-prepared for independence. And she admired my courage in standing up for myself. Inspired, she decided to go back to school, using her inheritance to enroll in community college. For the first time, we began to rebuild our relationship, free from our parents' influence. In the months that followed, I used my inheritance wisely, paying off debts, investing, and even planning to open a community center focused on mental health and financial literacy, two areas where I knew people often struggled in silence. My grandmother, a steadfast ally, shared stories of my grandfather's pride in my achievements, recounting how he had saved clippings of my academic accomplishments and college acceptance letters. Knowing that someone had seen my worth all along was both healing and heartbreaking. As for my parents, our relationship remains strained. My mother has started therapy, slowly acknowledging the harm caused by years of favoritism. But my father remains distant, unable to see past his resentment. Despite the pain, I've learned that family doesn't always mean unconditional love and support. Sometimes, it's the people who choose to stand by you, whether blood-related or not, who become your true family. Reflecting on this journey, I realize that self-worth isn't determined by our parents' approval. It's something we build for ourselves. I encourage anyone facing similar struggles to stand up for what they deserve. You are worthy, even if those closest to you can't see it. And sometimes, claiming what's rightfully yours, even when it causes conflict, is an act of self-love and respect. Family dynamics can be complex, but in the end, you are responsible for your own happiness and well-being. I now look forward to building a future where I can break the cycle of favoritism and create a family built on fairness and love.